I travel a lot on different adventure motorcycles, and this is my KTM 1090 Adventure Review. This is a broadcast from Gran Canaria. Canary Islands are resorts for those who live in resorts. We need places to rest too. Living on an island is not everyone's cup of tea, but an occasional rest there is a different thing. I got the KTM for a longer time. I shot so many beauties of nature, and I want to share them all. I'll link some of the most scenic roads of Gran Canaria to my taste in the description. So, the KTM 1090. The model has an appealing idea. It's not the same as its predecessor, the 1290, and it's not a different concept. I'd call it a base version of the 1290 with a smaller engine. Something like a 750 GS or a Tiger 850, but a snappy 1000cc. A basic 1290 Super Adventure S is a fully packed motorcycle, having a semi-active suspension in stock, both the front and the rear, advanced screen dash, full keyless access, LED lights as well as cornering lights, cruise control, cornering ABS, cornering traction control, center stand, tire pressure monitors, a radar, and so on. Again, it has all of that from the factory. Let's not compare it to stock versions of any of its competitors and compare their prices. But the 1090 Adventure is almost the same thing, but with no fancy electronics. Its price is about 6,000 euros lower. That is to say, it was, because the budget big motorcycle lineup was discontinued 2 years ago. 1050 first, and then the 1090. There was an announcement last year that they plan to update the lineup, adding a real basic version of the 1290, but somehow it's still not here. Yes, I know the 1090 had its predecessor, the European market-only 1050, that had an artificially detuned engine. Most of this review is relevant for that 1050 as well. The new 1090 Adventure road bike was priced a little cheaper than the basic Africa Twin, an off-road R version that was as much as an Africa Twin Adventure Sports. On a used market, a 1090 and Africa Twin of the same year cost about the same. The point is that the Africa Twin is the 1090's main competitor. And I have to mention that prices have changed, and after recent updates, a brand new Africa Twin Adventure Sports is just 500 euros cheaper than a KTM 1290 Super Adventure that has much more extras in stock. The Africa Twin has two versions. There is one for very long rides, and there's another one for some shorter rides. The 1090, as well as many other KTMs, was split by two versions too, but differently. There is a road option with 19 and 17-inch wheels, having a modest suspension focused on good pavement handling, and an off-road R version having a more impressive suspension and spoked 21 and 18-inch wheels. And it makes me sad that Honda still doesn't offer an adventure sports version with a 19-inch wheel and a shorter suspension, like that of the KTM 1290 Adventure T. The R version is a full competitor of the Africa Twin and BMW F850 GS, while the basic version might make a competition to many bikes, for example the V-Strom 1000, the 1200 GS, Tiger 900 GT, Super Tenere, and so on. And it's not afraid to be compared to 1200cc motorcycles. Just an example, the 1090 has the same peak power as the 1200 GS of the same model years, with the only difference in low revs torque, and for sure it's stronger than the Super Tenere. Modern day KTMs have some unique performance, so these motorcycles won't leave anyone cold. After some first looks at the Australians, you would never say that these ugly vehicles might be that fast. The second point is that they have a unique V-twin character that was tuned in a tuning house. So let's compare the engine's geometries. It's difficult to compare it with an Africa Twin's engine because Honda chose a long stroke engine path like in a car. This is a different story with its pros and cons. But what we can do is compare the KTM 1090 with a V-Strom 1000. Both engines have similar solutions. They're V-twins with similar strokes. Both have 2 spark plugs per cylinder, both have red lines ending at 1200 RPMs, and both have peak power on the same revs. But as a result, the KTM is strong while the V-Strom is boring as hell. At least when you're out of the town. Unfortunately, there is no appropriate dyno chart for a 1090. There is one combined for an Africa Twin and a 1090 from motorcycle.com, but their Africa's results don't match any other tester's results. As well as the KTM showing a peak torque lower than a V-Strom or an Africa Twin 1100, which conflicts with the claimed numbers. And it would only make sense to compare torque using the same dyno system having the same setting, otherwise you get too much inaccuracy. I think this is a good time to tell you something. That's right, the KTMs have a shorter stroke and the pistons themselves are lighter, but let's assume that the V-Strom 1000 and the KTM 1090 have the same torque. I'm not sure I can find 2 other motors who share so similar geometry and at the same time perform so differently. Gear ratio is the ratio of the number of teeth on a driver gear and a driven gear. Each gear in a gearbox has a different gear ratio. Usually it's presented as not a ratio of 2 numbers, but as only 1 number. It's a result of dividing the ratio numbers. So, when the gear ratios are higher, the gearbox is called short. Transmission of torque and acceleration are better, you can ride in a narrow effective rev range, but you will have to switch gears more often. When the gear ratios are low, the gearbox is correspondingly long. It has a higher top speed on each gear, but the acceleration is weaker. And when you gear up, you get a bigger RPM drop. This is common knowledge for anyone who has ridden a bicycle. The problem here is you cannot see it on a torque and power chart because the measurements are performed on a close to a direct drive gear. It's usually the highest one. I'm showing the charts not to show you some absolute numbers, but to see a difference in engine behaviors. They're not answering who's faster. Do you remember my review of the S1000XR? I told you that they have changed gearbox ratios. XR used to have longer gear ratios like on a Supersport before, but then it got 1/10 decreased ones. I'm not describing some features such as final drive ratio to make it easier to explain. We can easily witness it on an Africa Twin where the DCT has a lower gear ratio, but because it has more gears, the result is the same. Curious fact, the last generations of DCTs have either the same or almost the same gear drive ratios. While the first models got shorter, the second and third accelerate faster. Some people try to achieve the same result by changing sprockets, but it's not the same. When you add a few teeth to a sprocket, you change the final gear ratio, which affects every gear. It might decrease top speed or an acceleration on any gear, while the gearing is a more flexible system. A manufacturer can make the gears quicker, but the last one's highway-ish, not sacrificing any top speed. And this is what KTMs do. The first 3 to 4 gears are sporty, others are for highways, while V-Strom and Africa Twin have a completely opposite approach. Only the first gear is torquey, but that's it. The second and further are made to save fuel. It's neither good nor bad, but it explains why people who want to get a more explosive acceleration should avoid these motorcycles, while calm riders find the KTMs too jerky because whatever happens, it wants to do a wheelie. I mean, there are some people who might prefer the Africa Twin or the V-Strom engine, and there are others who prefer the KTM ones. Just try to feel the deeper difference. It's not just about power. If you only change sprockets on an Africa Twin or a V-Strom, you'll get similar acceleration, but you're going to lose the top speed. Anyway, KTM 1090 is the most powerful and torquiest adventure motorcycle up to 1100cc, almost being lightweight and having a decent tank. Power to weight ratio of the 1090 is typical for KTMs, being one of the best in adventure class. And this is not a case where there's only the top end, but there are no lows. We might also consider well-known sporty adventure bikes, but the S1000XR is just ruining our statistics with its ultimate power figures. But you won't see much of a difference between the Africa Twin or a V-Strom and a KTM in a city. KTMs shine on empty roads and freeways. Off-road? It depends on your riding style. KTM is punchier, and if you enjoy riding aggressively and hard, wheeling all the time, it's going to be a great experience. If you want to have a smooth ride, like most people prefer riding on dirt roads, you won't get much difference from other 1000cc motorcycles. What makes Africa Twin even more comfy is its suspension. It's plush and waggly, while KTM has a tighter and stiffer one to make the motorcycle handle sharper. If we consider bigger displacement motorcycles, the 1090 has a performance of a 1290 Super Adventure in a rain mode. So the difference is that the 1090 has enough power for anything, and it's not a case where it's not enough power. But a 1290 gives you a satisfying whee when you twist it on any RPMs. This is an experience that's worth buying extra. Of course, it usually depends on what you're used to. If you jump on a V-Strom after a 400cc motorcycle, you're gonna be going wee too. The KTM has a torquey engine, but it's not a high revs only 4-cylinder one. It has a decent grunt on 350 RPMs and further. It doesn't have a punch from the idle, but it doesn't sputter too. So it deserves its credit in any situation. It does uphill on low revs, and when it's needed, it moves the ground. So, regarding the gear ratios, I've probably scared half of you that you'll have to switch gears all day long. You can leave the clutch on the second gear at 20 to 25 kilometers per hour and it'll go smooth. 30 to 40 is usually a speed for traffic filtering. Above 50, it gives you a punch, right when you're leaving the traffic. And you're still in second gear, so when you're filtering, you don't have to switch back and forth. The third gear starts at 35 kilometers per hour. Works smooth, you don't have to disengage the clutch. So it's a gear choice for cities or twisties. The first gear goes idle at about 15 kilometers per hour. If you forgot to drop a gear and went to the fourth one in a city, no problem, it doesn't sputter. So, at the end of the day, the gearing works fine. Yes, you should click it sometimes when you ride twisties, but it's not like on a Super Sport. The clutch. It's smooth and it's hydraulic. Vibrations don't cause any issues in a city. You cannot blame a bike for it. About the size of the motorcycle, it's significantly narrower than the Africa Twin or a V-Strom on all key points like handguards, handlebars, mirrors, and the difference is about 10 centimeters. It's much easier to go through traffic. From the other side, Africa Twin has an automatic gearbox. That, for many people, is more important than motorcycles' width in a city traffic. So for commuting through a town, the Africa Twin is still a good option because of the DCT. From the third side, an automatic off-road is more of a con than a pro. That's why people usually buy a slim version of an Africa Twin on a manual. The Buzz is a typical KTM one. You don't get any, or you get a minor one lower than 5,000 RPMs, and you get some after that, but I wouldn't say it vibrates as much as a 690, 790, or 890. But it's enough to annoy you. So 5,100 RPMs makes 130 kilometers per hour on the 6th gear, so it doesn't pass a highway test. But on a V-Strom 1000, it's even worse. People also blame KTM's 1090, 1190, and the first-gen 1290 for having too hot of engines. There were plastic Puig fairings working in a heat screen on the test bikes. Maybe they make a difference, but I didn't get anything bad about it while I was riding a hot enough coastal road. Also, many people are scared to deal with an engine with a compression rate of 13:1. Making it higher is one of the ways to increase power. Higher the compression ratio is, stronger the air-fuel mixture is compressed before it's fired by a spark plug. More pressure you get in the combustion chamber, more effective and cleaner the engine is, but with a few notes. In theory, the compression ratio is related to an octane number of the fuel used. The lower the number, the lower the compression ratio should be, as well as the temperature and the pressure in the engine. While a higher octane petrol won't start burning by itself, and it has a higher combustion temperature, and it's suited for high combustion ratio engines. These figures depend on each other, so the petrol requirements change with time regardless if we want them to change or not. Even just 10 years ago, they used to be different. For example, it's impossible to find a 92 RON petrol on European gas stations, so it doesn't make sense to keep producing modern vehicles with lower compression ratio. And the rest of the world keeps up. I cannot tell you about every single country, but in India they have increased their petrol quality over the last 10-15 years. So you can get a decent 95 RON today. And this is a country where they still use man-powered carriages. The biggest risk is that if the compression ratio is too high, the lower octane petrol might explode before it should have sparked, which gradually destroys the engine. From the other side, an engine having lower compression ratio might not be able to burn the fuel completely. No good as well. If you get a general petrol recommendation datasheet from the internet, it'll tell you to use 98 Premium on 13 CR engines. So why does KTM recommend you use 95 RON while it's even compatible of accepting a 92 RON? For example, an S1000XR has a compression ratio of 12:5:1, and 98 Premium as a recommended petrol according to the datasheet. More of that, Multistrada V4 has a 14:1 compression ratio, so it should be fed with a 102 RON, while Ducatis themselves recommend using a 95. And a Super Duke has 13:6, but it's claimed to operate on the 95th. So, are the Ducatis or KTMs fools? I mean, of course they are, but this is not the case. The thing is, datasheets were created for an abstract engine with no fancy technologies that are pretty advanced today. So you should understand that when the petrol explosion might happen, it usually happens when the mixture starts being fired, but it doesn't get enough time to fire up completely. The temperature of the mixture and its pressure are being increased, and this might cause an explosion. So one of the standard solutions implemented by KTM is using 2 spark plugs per cylinder. So one spark plug is firing the mixture, and after a short delay, the second one fires it up from the other side before the overheated gas might explode by itself. The key is to trigger the spark plugs independently. It takes into consideration the RPM, the air temperature, and so on. Then a CPU calculates when the second spark plug should be triggered to make the mixture burn completely and smoothly within a given speed of the combustion right before it might explode. So, we can say that having 2 spark plugs makes the engineering system way too complicated and it's not reliable. Checkmate! But the 2 spark plug technology was given to us by our grandfathers, so you can see it in old Japanese bikes. Or if you need something closer as an example, V-Strom 1000 and the Africa Twin 1100. And, by the way, the good old XRV 750 Africa Twin had 2 spark plugs in a cylinder. There is no overcomplication. They just have an opportunity to make the solution even more accurate and efficient, which was not possible to do in the carburetor era. One more trick to make the detonation free is to create an additional air turbulence in the combustion chamber while the mixture is being fired, so it fires up before it becomes able to explode. They can do this by building combustion chambers of a unique shape that create additional airflows to make the mixture fire up even faster. Even if you just take a quick look at KTM's pistons and forget how thin they have made them, you'll see the shape is so complex and it doesn't let them look like old pistons as they used to look like in the mid-1900s. The piston is a part of the combustion chamber, and these edges have also increased velocity. There are also many other things that didn't exist in the good old times. For example, fuel injection systems can make an aerosol with smaller drops that take less time to be burned. So, at the end of the day, the KTM doesn't care about the petrol used anymore. The worst case scenario is it might lose some grunt in the wilderness of an African savanna. By the way, the KTM had an off-road dongle that made it possible to use RON 80 petrol until 2016, and a lower compression ratio is overvalued. What a coincidence, I own a motorcycle with a compression ratio of 8:1. And I also have experience traveling on a motorcycle with a CR lower than 7. They don't make them anymore, and it's for good. My experience says that these motors cut from adulterated petrol as bad as performance-oriented ones. And modern Euro 4 and Euro 5 hardly operates on bad fuel no matter what compression ratio they have. So here is my thought. Why would you risk a lower compression ratio motorcycle just because you might have to go to Africa one day and ride 99% of the time in places that have a decent petrol? Maybe you can just get a bottle of octane corrector to that only journey you're going to have? Anyway, it's not an easy job to find a petrol that your motorcycle will not ride on at all. The gearbox is very similar to the 1190s and the older 1290s. The only issue that many people find annoying is it's difficult to find a neutral. It was that case on both 1090s I rode on, so I just left them on a gear to stop pissing them off. Otherwise, it's superb. I know that older 1290s have some complaints with their gearbox, but even that worked out flawlessly for me. It might happen that I switch gears in some KTM style. Unfortunately, it is a legacy from older KTM engines, so it doesn't have a quick shifter. Not as an available option too, as well as on the 1190 and 1290 before 2017. So there is one on a 390, a 690, and an 890, but not a 1090. So deal with it. Their gearbox changes gears clearly, but it requires some force. So you might wish a little better if you were used to using Honda's gears, but I didn't have any problems during my week of riding. There were no false neutrals or any other issues. The new gearboxes that you get on 1290 Super Adventures are by Pinkel. They operate a little smoother, that's for sure. If you have touring or adventure boots, the old one will work fine. You never accidentally change gears. You have good feedback while not having to kick it too hard. The footrest and the gear level have wide adjustments, which is typical for KTMs. The bar mounts can be moved back and forth, also a KTM feature. So the ergo doesn't have any problems for taller riders. You sit straight, comfy, and everything is where it should be. The knees are relaxed. While standing, it works as good as an Africa Twin for my 188 centimeters. I could ride for hours standing on it. If you put the handlebar in a more upright position, you can just stand upright on it and having your knees straight and your back as you wish. It is useful on long hauls, and this is what you cannot do on a small motorcycle. If you compare it to an Africa Twin, the both are great, but not the V-Strom 1000. Unlike the Africa Twin, the KTM has a wider and shaped seat, so even if you don't like the stock one because of some odd reason, you can easily replace it with something softer, so it's almost as comfy as on a touring bike. The Africa Twin seat doesn't have that shape, so it's not that easy to find a comfortable one, and this is what many people complain about when they buy one for just road use. The seat itself was pretty fine and didn't cause any discomfort. It's not the best in the world, but I probably wouldn't change it. But because it is wide, I wouldn't recommend this motorcycle if you're any shorter than 180 centimeters. It just wouldn't be your cup of tea. When the seat is in a lower setting, it has the same height as an Africa Twin, but because it's narrower on the Honda, it's easier to reach the ground if you're not tall enough. But this is not my problem, both of them fit me just fine. This is if we're talking about the S version. The thing is, the 1090R is much taller than an Africa Twin if you compare the seats while they are in the exact same ground clearance and suspension travels. I couldn't find a significantly lower seat for the KTM, so I think it's just a motorcycle for tall people. And they also have some awesome 890 adventure for those who are shorter than 180 centimeters. It's a different story with an Africa Twin. There is room to make it lower just by replacing the seat. The lower seat from Honda makes it 3 centimeters lower. There are also some aftermarket options on the internet that claim to lower it by 6 centimeters, so if you're shorter than 180, I can definitely recommend you get an Africa Twin instead of a KTM 1090. The windshield depends on the version you get. The KTM 1090R has a stump as well as a basic Africa Twin. S has a similar one to the Africa Twin Adventure Sports of the same model years. It's okay, but I prefer the one from KTM with my height. But this is just a minor point. There are plenty of aftermarket options, and they're hands down better than the one from the V-Strom and most mid-side adventure motorcycles. The windshield here is adjustable. It has a noticeable lift of about 8 centimeters, and while it's in its highest position, it can be adjusted back and forth a little, which is very uncommon. It works well up to 130 kilometers an hour at least, and I can ride with no additional effort and with an open visor and no goggles. I didn't notice any helmet buffeting. Is it the best windshield? No, it's not. But it's good enough for many people who might want to take a long journey. It's very uncommon to get a better screen from the factory on an adventure motorcycle. In general, it has a similar wind protection to a 1290 Super Adventure, so there is something to think about here. Some 1200cc touring motorcycles might get a better one, but among a lighter bike for the price or a mid-size motorcycle, and especially a proper adventure motorcycles, this wind protection is great. There is no direct flow to your knees or arms or shoulders. Right after this test, I sat in a V-Strom 1000 and realized the day was cold. It might happen to see a 5-degree mark, but I was in summer gear and no additional linings, and I was fine. The wind didn't bother me on the KTM. The handguards are the same way as they used to be on older KTMs. 2 layers there. A soft plastic on the top and a hard bracket that protects your hands and survives after a hard crash. There are also optional heated grips that were quite a surprise considering how budget-oriented this bike is. It has simple cheap switches as you might see on an Indian-made 390 Adventure. Usually, the easiest way to understand what components are used on a motorcycle is to see its brakes and compare them with competitors. It works for bicycles too, but it doesn't work with the 1090. It's far easier to compare how much brakes cost and compare that as opposed to, say, suspension. You can easily find out how much brakes costs, and the KTM has one of the best brakes among lighter adventure motorcycles. When you're using them, you realize they don't try to cut down on your motorcycle. I understand that this is the matter of taste, and Africa Twin has good enough brakes too, especially combining them with a softer suspension, but when I ride the KTM, I never think about the brakes until I sit on a different motorcycle. The KTM brakes just as I want it. I haven't seen any KTM yet that had other than good brakes. One more interesting thing is that KTMs, with all of their expensive components or high-techs, are still hiding everything inside. It's even more pleasant to see a welding process than you see a KTM, with maybe some minor exceptions. Many people want to get a Norden 901 just because it looks like a normal motorcycle, what you cannot say about the 890 Adventure. The 1090 doesn't even have a pate. It has a black plastic with a polyamide cover with vinyl stickers, just as cheap as a 390 Adventure or dirt bikes. For me, this is a good thing they took from competitive bikes. I don't want to pay for a finish on a motorcycle that is intended to be dropped off-road. Yes, the plastic easily gets scratches, but it doesn't crack from hits. For example, some Ducatis are pretty capable too, but I vomit right after I realize that I need to drop it on rocks and turn it 180 degrees. But with a KTM, you're always ready for adventures because scratches and duct tape just hide its ugliness, while you'll think twice before riding a Ducati off the pavement. One of the biggest differences with the KTM 1290 is its suspension. This is one of the most ambiguous things here. Let's start with the road version S. The shock is adjustable for a preload and its rebound. The biggest issue is that on the S, the fork is not adjustable at all, and it's a sad limitation on an off-road capable machine with 185 millimeters of wheel travel. The suspension itself is not bad, but even with no adjustments, it works pretty well off-road. But there are two things about it. First one is the fork adjustments. Let me explain. When I first took the motorcycle, I hadn't been to my hotel yet, so I had a pretty heavy backpack with me all day riding mountains. Not the best experience. In terms of rough pavements, it worked fine, smoothing it enough and didn't have any waggling as a proper KTM should work. You wouldn't be shamed riding together with Africa Twins and an 850 GS on dirt roads, considering this is still a road version. As well, it is good enough in a town, but it wasn't enough of it on a twisties. The problem here is the braking. The weight is moved to the front wheel and the motorcycle dives with its load, but after the turn, the weight is going back and the fork is straightened up. The geometry is changing back and forth and the handling is going down. I would say it handles like some mid-sized bikes with a difference that it eats rough surfaces better. The issue is you cannot fix a preload adjustment. So after the first day, I was disappointed because you can never call WP suspension squishy, and I wasn't glad to enjoy a mediocre handling the whole week. The next morning, I left my luggage in the hotel and I started riding an unloaded bike, and the suspension turned into a completely different ride. It stopped diving. It was perfect on twisties, and for the adventure class, it was perfect. You can never ride like that on an Africa Twin. So, they have tuned up the suspension for a solo rider. That makes sense. But who takes an adventure with no luggage? No one. So, we get a fork and will never be enough in a real-life use, and it'll just need 1 or 2 extra turns of the preload knob. Yes, you can get different cartridges for the fork. The cheapest one I could quickly find was 500 euros from Andriani Misano. A Touratech one is more than 1,000. For me, it's a solution, but I highly doubt anyone would throw another 10% of the motorcycle price just to tune up the suspension, while 10 to 15% is the price difference between a 1090 and a 1290. You can also try to use a thicker oil, but then you lose the versatileness. The fork will become stiffer in all conditions. The V-Strom 1000, considering its cheapo suspension that cannot smooth any terrain, still beats the KTM because when you get a passenger and a luggage, you're still able to twist the preloaded knobs on both the shock and the fork to make it handle better. From an off-road perspective, if you would know how pissed off I am to perform off-road tests on road tires when you're just not allowed to drop bikes. There are so many attractive dirt roads on the Canary Islands that are perfect for heavy adventure motorcycles. They are not technical, but they are scenic. So, from the off-road standpoint, the 1090 Adventure S is limited by its cast wheels. The suspension, of course, because of the missing adjustments and shorter travel, is significantly weaker than a 1291, even if it is an S. So, some generic dirt or gravel roads, sure, you can, and it's hands down better than its main competitor, the V-Strom, but if there are rocks, you must go slow. If we considered a brand new motorcycle, KTMs have an optional spoked wheels. Now it'll make it less than 1,000 euros. That is an inappropriate mod for a used motorcycle. You can consider some aftermarket options of some used ones, but this is the path that most people will seek. I, for one, won't mess with. So you have a potential, but you have to ride 30 to 40 kilometers an hour. The sweet spot is here. If you try to go faster, the rocks hit the motorcycle too hard and you start to be afraid to damage the bike. The ground clearance is huge for a class of semi-road motorcycles. What I like in the KTM's version S is their clearance lets you forget that you might hit something with your engine's bottom, so dirt tracks don't bother you. Many other 19-inch adventure bikes are just starving. By the way, there is an off-road mode with according ABS and traction control setting as an option. But this is not a huge problem because the ABS is switchable and the traction control usually is being disabled by off-road enthusiasts. and by contrast with modern siblings, the traction control and ABS are not cornering. That being said, many basic versions of 1200cc motorcycles still don't give you that either, as well as most of the direct competitors of the given years. The new Africa Twin does, but the price tag is different too. Unfortunately, I have not ridden the 1090R, but it's not a surprise, it does have a fully adjustable suspension as well as 21 and 18-inch wheels, and extra ground clearance. According to its reviews, it has a stiff suspension for better handling, so on pavement it behaves better than a plush one on Africa Twin, Tenere, or an 850 GS, and I believe that. And usually it is the case that WP suspensions are just best. It's nothing to argue with. Unfortunately, the version R has an even taller seat height, so there are not many people who would like to tiptoe on every traffic light, but for only off-road use, the entire class is too big and heavy. The fuel consumption was claimed as 5.6 liters per 100 kilometers, but I got 6 to 6.5 on mountains, but I wish to save a little. It might be dropped a little lower than 6. V-Strom eats about 5.7 in similar conditions. Africa is about the same. If you ride it like it's your last day, the consumption will be about the same. It even might happen to a KTM that has better mileage. In general, it eats about a half liter or a liter more, and it's almost the same as its big brother 1290 does. Not the biggest issue because of a GIB tank, but if you were to compare the consumption with the others, the tank doesn't make that impression anymore. The tank is 23 liters. My real-life mileage was about 400 kilometers, or a little more riding in not the most fuel-savvy style. The range is enough. Yes, the Africa Twin Adventure Sports might go more than 500 if you save up the fuel, but it has a different weight category, so it probably should be compared to other heavyweight bikes like KTM 1290 Super Adventure T, which has a 30-liter tank and whose mileage is far bigger than 500 kilometers. Curb weight is not claimed by KTM, but it should be a little lighter than 230 kilograms. It is as a base Africa Twin with a manual transmission has, which is a standard figure for lighter bike. It looks like it's light, but from the other side, 1190 had the same weight and a 1290 is 10 kilograms heavier, but carrying its weight lower if we're considering the 2021 model. All of these motorcycles have similar sizes and 23-liter fuel tanks. The 1090 has lowered fuel tanks too, but they're not as low as they are on the 1290 or an 890. So it's a mediocre stat. It feels similarly to a base Africa Twin or an 850 GS. It is a good stat for a lighter bike. You can save up off-road, but it's still night and day compared to the KTM 790, and you don't want to drop it in the mud. You gotta expect that. This is a class for those who travel in a group rather than alone, or you should avoid difficult terrains. Before we make a summary, let's talk the extras. Good thing about KTMs is they have at least some protection. Even if it has rubber mounts, which is usually enough for occasional riders who might experience a few standstill drops, including a generic engine bash plate, fork legs, and exhaust protection that is uncommon for a road bike from stock. It might make sense to put protection bars on a version R, and there are some from stock. According to YouTube stats, the KTM is compared to the Africa Twin, GS, Tenere, and Multistrada 950. Among these ones, the only one that has bars in base is the KTM. This is just an example. Again, LED running lights were sold as extras by other manufacturers back then. Here they are from stock. It has the same screen as the older 1190 and 1090. It's an LCD, but it shows everything great. But there is a flip side. KTM wanted to separate the models and not to hurt the sales of the 1290, so there are some limitations caused by marketing. They might not be expensive, but then make your life worse. There is no power socket. Even the cheapo 390 has some. It's not a huge deal, there's even a harness for it, but it's a sign. The next is non-adjustable suspension. It's not that costly to add some, but it's a must because of the length. Especially when the 1290 has the semi-active one just from stock, the models are separated anyway. The cheapo 390 has one, and the KTMs didn't suffer. But from the other side, there are not so many people who would adjust their forks, and the stock adjustments are pretty versatile. The third thing is the motorcycle has neither cruise control nor a quick shifter, even as a paid extra. It wouldn't even save up cost, people will just pay on top. It's not that bad to ride in a city with no quick shifter as it is to travel with no cruise control. Again, even a smaller 390 has a quick shifter. But I understand, it was a legacy limitation from an 1190. If it had all these options, I would say the motorcycle is a great value for its money for journeys, but as it is a good one only for those who are not spoiled yet and ready to customize it for themselves. A cruise control by MC Cruise is 500 euros, a quick shifter from Hilltech is 300. The solutions if you need them. And even without mods, I can say that there are people who would just buy the base versions of motorcycles. Otherwise, where do they later arrive to sales listings? The R version is a good motorcycle, but only for those who are tall. Cruise control is not that needed on an off-road focused journey, and you can live without a quick shifter too, because you don't switch gears as often as you do on pavements. It's not an off-road case when you are riding on knobbies and you need a 1290's power. Even that being said, the 1090s limits a power delivery of 100 horsepower in off-road mode. All the other bells and whistles, such as additional cornering lights or hill start controls, don't make much of a difference, I suppose. The conventional bulbs can be replaced, or you could add some extra lights for a fraction of the cost. This is not a deal breaker. On a European market, the 1290 and 1090 of the same year cost around the same, and about 10 to 15% difference is not that big of a saving. The 1290 Super Adventure is a much more advanced bike right off the bat, and in general it is one of my favorite motorcycles. And you will think one or more time before buying one because there is an Africa Twin of the same year for the same price, and the Africa Twin is a decent competitor. To be continued with another adventure motorcycle review, so please subscribe so you don't miss them, and stay tuned.